I've been working on a map project, and we've called it the Hmong Walking Map Project, and that project began a couple of years ago with Annie Wetter, who's in CPS. And the project was to develop a map that was culturally relevant for Hmong residents, particularly elder Hmong. And the project as a whole is to try to encourage low-impact activity, increase activity for at-risk Hmong patients who are at risk of diabetes, obesity. And so it was an ethnographic project. I was sort of heading it up as an anthropologist. We did interviews with Hmong members of the community. And then we developed a map and then took that back to the informants that we worked with to revise it. And we learned from the project that our original ideas were not going to meet the needs of the Hmong population, and therefore we came up with a new set of maps. And so we're still working on the project. Our hope is to eventually have it be a research project at one of the hospitals. I began teaching at UWSP 7 years ago, and ever since I started teaching here, I've had Hmong students in my classes. And it was through that I became interested in Hmong culture and history, and I've integrated those Hmong culture and history into all of my classes. And so I've learned a lot from my students. I've completed projects in the community research project, and a major one was this one, Finding the Middle Way, which was a documentary about the Hmong people of Portage County.
Oh, that's cool.
And I worked in the early part of the project, primarily training Hmong students to go out and do interviews, and I wrote the grants for the project, things like that. The COFAC Creates was such an interesting project because it was so cross-disciplinary and people collaborating in really creative ways across disciplines. And the map project was fun because we were able to get feedback from people in geography and GIS, but also people in art and design. And that's what's fun about maps, is they're science and they're art at the same time, and they're also anthropology. So COFAC Creates brought all these things together, and it was just a really creative venue to work with people and collaborate. I really enjoyed that. My research actually focuses a lot on place and placemaking, but what was interesting about the Hmong Walking Map project was it took a focus on non-places. So the Hmong settlement or Hmong refugee experience is one of displacement. The early Hmong came here as refugees from the Secret War, and coming to a place where and at a time when Hmong people didn't speak English, didn't read English, and it was trying to imagine what their experience was coming to a community of primarily white people. Hmong people don't read and write at that time in English. What was it like getting around? And what was it like trying to fit into the community, in a community that was not very welcoming, I think, to Hmong people. And so the project sort of began to explore this idea of non-places. And the whole history of the Hmong experience has, going back in time, Hmong people were in China and they fought with the Chinese, and that's what led them into Laos. And in Laos, Hmong people were living in the mountains in order to maintain their Hmong identity. They were not Laotian. And so a series of displacements and conflicts and then obviously the Vietnam War that brought Hmong people here. So this idea, I spent so much of my academic career looking at place and placemaking and dwelling, but this idea of non-places for people like the Hmong, I think, was very interesting. And maps themselves are cultural projects, they are political projects, but when you think about what goes on to a map, it's just as interesting to think about what's not there. Mm-hmm. So when you think about what's relevant to people and what's not relevant is a cultural thing. And so we were trying to figure out what is relevant to Hmong people in this place. What are the landmarks? And how do people navigate their way around in the community when they may not be reading signs and using maps? Those came out of the interviews. Basically, we were asking open-ended questions, asking people how they got around. And it was out of that that we figured out landmarks that were important to people. What was really interesting is for elder Hmong, they're often being driven around by somebody else in the family. And basically memorizing how to get to places. And so what's relevant there is how many stop signs. A building this white building that's on the corner of this particular street becomes a landmark. But a lot of it is just memorizing the number of turns, the number of stop signs, the number of lights in particular places to turn. But what that means is people are walking on the highest traveled roads, which is not necessarily a pleasant place to walk. So we were trying to figure out ways that people could walk in their own neighborhood where they feel most comfortable and where they're most familiar. But it's really about breaking down communication barriers between physicians and Hmong patients. How do physicians communicate, okay, you need to walk 30 minutes 3 times a week or something like that. So the MAP project is a way of breaking down communication barriers.
That was with Diana Hoover and I. We taught the representation of place class on the winter interim session. And what we were doing was it was an interdisciplinary course, and we were, in a sense, an experimental phase of seeing the type of topical areas we were going to be working on, as well as in terms of the types of projects the students were going to be developing. So some of it was more planned, I'd say, in terms of what we were trying to do, and others of it we were a little bit more free-form in terms of what happened, especially with the student projects in the end. We were actually doing a class that we'd like to continue in the future, an IS class, basically because we saw a good cross-correlation between, let's say, art students and geography students taking a look at how they wanted to represent place. Because in essence, when you're talking representation of place, often you're dealing with maps. And cartography, the home of cartography, has always been in geography dating back even before the time of the Greeks. And so essentially, how you represent a particular place can be very different depending upon your cultural and social attitudes of that particular time period. So Diana, what she did, she got interested in developing these whole projects of the COFAC Creates in terms of, in this case, looking at representation of place, and was because she went to a conference, the North American Cartographic Information Society, or NACIS conference, which is a whole set of usually about 500-600 cartographers who get together every year from all walks of life, from government, private business, universities, and just talking about in terms of map making in general. And she's already always had a fondness, and hopefully in her interview she'll talk more about that, in terms of interest in maps, especially since she, even in the class that we taught, she talked about earlier days of islands in Lake Michigan, for example, that she would explore. And so she went to this meeting, and she went to the follow-up meeting, and the first one she went to was in Minneapolis, and just got really, really excited about the concept of representation of mapping. And when she talked to cartographers there, again, what she discovered, of course, is that usually we're a pretty welcoming group. We like to have interaction between all different types of people who create different maps, whether it be a special artistic representation or looking at some digital representation that you might have. And again, that interest, I think, just led her to work on this COFAC Creates topical area. And then she found out, well, she approached geography as being one of the places that she thought was appropriate to be involved in that. And then she found out I also was a former president of NACIS back in the late 1990s. And so again, we just talk more about the organization in terms of cartography in general. So it was kind of a, I would have to say, an appropriate nexus of people on the same campus getting together and talking about similar topics. Yeah, the North American Cartographic Information Society is for a group that was formed way back in 1980, a long time ago. Anyway, but it was basically cartographers who wanted to, a lot of times organizations, academic organizations, just have university professors draw into that, and their students. But what a group of cartographers wanted back at that time is they wanted to infuse an organization that would be attractive to all different types of cartographers, whatever discipline, or it would whether it be in a university, whether it be in a private setting, a private business like Rand McNally, or whether or not it was in a government agency like the United States Geological Survey. They wanted everybody to basically be engaged so that we'd have conversations in terms of not only people creating maps for research, but the very, I would have to say, utilitarian, functional purposes of, well, we have to make a map for an airport, and for in terms of all the different pilots that are coming into the airport itself. So you'd have people from like the FAA come to these NACES meetings, and it was a very, I would have to say, it's always been a very energetic group of people because they always bring in a love of maps, number one, but it's also the fact in terms of how you communicate that information with people through all different types of various functions and societies. And so it mostly attracts people from North America, but certainly we've got an international crowd from time to time. It's never a huge meeting, though, too. It's usually anywhere from 400 to 600 people normally. Again, it's mostly just, again, the cartographers. Where you can go to some conferences, like there's a Geographic Information Science Conference out on the West Coast by Formula and Esri Conference, ESRI, where they have anywhere from 12,000 to 20,000 people going to this conference. Well, that's a lot of people. I mean, Stevens Point is 30,000, so you're saying, oh, I got a whole city going to a conference. But that can be fairly impersonal. You don't have as much interaction time to time. Plus, you have all kinds of different sessions and everything going on. So it can be extremely useful, and the knowledge base is immense. But sometimes a smaller meeting of people coming together is going to be more productive in trying to get a lot of interaction, especially in the evening hours where you're just sitting on a couch in the lounge area and you're talking to people you've never met before, and you have the conversations that, of course, are always going to be revolving around map making in this case. It's going to allow people to have a greater, I would have to say, freedom of talking about different ideas and feeling very open about it. Well, partly is, on this campus, especially with geography and also what's going in CNR, and then all the infusion of creativity over in art and design, there's always some type of mapping project going on here. There really is. And so that over the past years, for example, we had this big Wisconsin River Flowage bathymetry project in terms of depth. And so what happens is, like, what was going on the last couple of years is kind of what we try to concentrate on. And it is a very large diversity of projects. For example, I mentioned the Wisconsin Flowage map. Well, that was map made for recreationalists. We wanted to have very detailed depth of the Wisconsin River Flowage, people who fish there, who basically go boating, canoeing, kayaking, go on and on. I mean, they wanted to have a map that was going to be up to date, especially since it's a big draw, of course, the Wisconsin River. So very utilitarian, very functional. But at the same time, you come up with some very interesting projects, such as the Hmong map, where you're trying to create a map that's going to, in this case, through Tori Jennings, Professor Jennings, she wanted to create a map that was going to be used by the Hmong population, especially the non-English speaking population, so that they would feel more of a community with Stevens Point. And what we discovered was that there were these cultural variations or differences that occurred. And that was intriguing to me as a cartographer of having one of the projects to talk about, because again, when you're talking about representation of place, it's, well, it's like anything else, making a mark on the map. How do you make that mark? X, the treasure is here. Oh, I got that. But what you're looking at is how are you going to communicate? And mapping is a form of graphicacy. We communicate with arithmetic and math, symbols, and we communicate with a verbal language, of course, that we certainly have. And so there's these different ways that human beings, of course, can interact and understand each other. But graphicacy, again, is something that it's much more free form, and that's, I think, why somebody like Diana Hoover got interested in this in terms of the art project, in terms of how do you represent a different location, what kind of symbolization, how do you have the essence of that particular place. And for the Hmong, it was quite interesting because their symbols that they use are such that are very different than what we employ normally in Western civilization. So like we have like a P for parking. Oh, that's a symbol we use, very iconic. But that's not necessarily how they see it, how they envision it. And then you have the compounding effect of course, the English language really can't be used on the map. You have to think about, okay, again, how do I communicate that information? What we discovered, of course, I'm sure Dr. Jennings talked about this, was that it was more than just the fact of trying to create symbolization for the map they understand. It was the idea of who used the map. There was a big gender difference between male and female. There was these differences in terms of how they interpreted the information, even when they saw the same symbol in the same group of people, that you would say, oh, they're going to see a similar fact. No, that wasn't the case. So it's like anything else. If if we looked at mapping that was done by different civilizations, different cultural groups, for example, Marshall Islanders, when they were trying to develop a map, they used reeds and they created stick charts because they're in an oceanic environment. And so they have to figure out, oh, I'm going to go from point A to B, how to represent that. Well, I'm going to use a reed to show that. So that was what they were using. Or you're looking at Eskimos along the, let's say, along the former Northwest Territories, Alaskan area in North America. Well, they just drew maps for coastlines because that was imperative to them for fishing, for example, doing seal, walrus, or then when they created the maps, they would take like a tusk from a walrus, and they would carve into that. So that was the way that they were communicating their map, but it was all very culturally based. So when you're dealing with projects, circling back, when you're dealing with projects such as the Hmong map, it becomes a very fascinating topic of trying to research how really does this group of people communicate culturally, going back to when they, of course, lived in Laos and Southeast Asia. How are they basically, how did they use a map even back then? Well, again, what we discovered is that a lot of times they ingrained their maps, even mentally in their cognitive maps. They didn't necessarily had a paper copy for what they were using. And then, of course, there was gender differences where males used the maps and females usually didn't use the maps. But you still had to figure out how to go down to the stream to get water, or you still had to figure out, go to find a supply of wood. It's just basically human culture that you have to have those kinds of basic survival skills. So again, it gets ingrained in, well, how could we understand that whole process? So working on that kind of project was very useful to try to give people, when talking about these different map projects going on, about the diversity of how somebody looks at a map and how somebody represents place, versus something like, again, the Wisconsin, in this case, Wisconsin River flowage map, or even the map, another map that Tori Jennings worked on with some of our students, her bike map, trying to show the best areas that you can bike around campus. Very functional, utilitarian. But then you get maps such as, well, I want to show information that's going to be more of a story. And this worked into the story maps that we had in the representation of place class. That in the end, the students had to use software ArcGIS Online, and they had to create these map vignettes to explain locations but have a story behind it. And that was kind of very interesting because we allowed them to pretty much, as long as they were telling basically a map story of a location, then we gave them carte blanche of what they could do. And some of them decided to do a story, not in Stevens Point, of maybe some place like looking at wolves in terms of the mountain states of the U.S. Or maybe somebody says, oh, well, I'm going to do a story map about all the different waterfalls around particular counties in Wisconsin. And another person was totally... That gnome one. Yeah, the fictitious one, the fantasy one, which is fine. It's kind of like, yeah, it's like Lord of the Rings, sure, why not? That the fact that there was a history of gnomes that lived underground here underneath the campus, and of course would pop up in certain areas, and they had underground tunnels and locations and features. And it was interesting because what the student was doing was saying, we want you to work on something you have an interest in, and then create this story behind it. If it doesn't exist, in this case the gnome, it was their own storyline, and they said, okay, we're going to work on that. So it was very diverse in terms of what they came up with. And it makes it a little bit harder as a teacher to try to make sure you're structuring it enough so they can get all done within a certain time period, at the same time trying to not to stifle any creativity. So for me, it was fascinating because in the end, you had a collection of all these digital story maps that people could look at. Some of the ideas that people didn't follow up on because there wasn't enough time is like one person, what she did is she created a kind of a history of downtown Stevens Point, and she had basically where she was showing different locations of features and giving kind of more of this background of the last 200 years. What we wanted to do was do a little bit of more of a swipe map too, but we didn't have time where she could have gone through and showed 5 or 6 different maps over the last 100 years of Stevens Point, and then you could just kind of use a swipe cursor and then go from one time period to the other and take a look at locations.
Some of those up at the art gallery, I know.
Right. So, I mean, that's exactly what, you know, some students say, oh, I'd like to try. But there wasn't enough time because we'd have to collect all the maps, we'd have to scan them, we'd have to do something called georectification on the maps and then fit them all together. And if it was a regular and if it was a regular semester, could have done that. So having a 3-week time limit was a little daunting at times, but the students still came up with some wide variety. Well, for example, another student basically did a Pokemon land that has, you know, it was like developing all these different sites and locations of features that happen within that particular universe for that. So yeah, we were intrigued at all the time in terms of what people were working with. It just made it a little more difficult, as I said, where we were trying to see what they wanted to do, what they could accomplish, and then trying to basically give them more direction in terms of what could be done and what they could finalize within that 3-week time period. And again, even when they were working on it, they had like a week and a half. The first week and a half was all preliminary background work. Well, ideally, to give people more time to work on some of these topics, probably having fall or spring would be better. The problem that Diana Hoover and I both have is trying to fit it in with all the other schedules of classes that you have for students, that the winter might be better for teaching it because we have more time to devote in that period. And it's very difficult to get team teaching between different colleges too, because the colleges, when students take credit hours, of course, it's always assignment in terms of how many credit hours every department has to basically have by the end of the year to make sure that everybody is doing appropriate amount of equal work among all faculty and colleges and so. So basically what happens is the best way to teach an IS when you're doing team teaching is actually do having 2 separate classes, but it's the same class, but it's cross-listed. So having that, meaning that one department and the other department, they both get the same amount of credit. So like, oh, I have 20 students signed up in this section, 20 and this other section, but it's taught at the same time. And that way you don't have the problem with colleges have to battling out for student credit hours for that. So the winter intern is a way of doing that, but certainly during the regular semester, I think students would be able to, you know, not to say these students didn't really enjoy what they were doing, but I think they would have more time to assimilate the data. So yes, we'd like to do it again. We're just always trying to work it into our schedules. Well, her project is, we're basically trying to get funding to, she knows what she wants to do. She wants to create these section neighborhood maps for among the U's so that they can go out basically and have these folks get more exercise. And it's likely that once the information for these neighborhoods is corroborated, we're going to look for funding for the printing, and it's very likely that even something like Ministry Health would probably help fund part of that. So that will continue, and I think within the next year it'll be complete. The different other kind of projects we're working on, we're still working on projects where we're going to do more mapping of the Wisconsin River flowage up toward Lake Dubay and maybe Lake Dubay eventually to get a much more accurate mapping of those areas. Those are where we'll continually, until we start mapping out probably half of the river, we probably won't be done, that'll be going on for years. But one interesting project that we're doing is in the GI Center is that we're working on this specialized Wausau kiosk. It's kind of this concierge service where it'll basically be kind of similar to Yelp, but very specialized, where it's going to be an app. And essentially, when people are living in Wausau, especially younger people, they want to know, well, what kind of activities, where can I go out for entertainment, what's available. And so we're developing this specialized one for the city of Wausau that will be done probably in about a year. And that takes a certain amount of field work, but also in terms of programming in the digital sphere. So that's another project that I think should be done within the next about year and a half. It's a little bit different. Plus, we're always working with county governments. For example, we work with the city of Stevens Point and trying to help update some of their zoning map information. And then, one project that we're going to probably do for the campus, that there's a certain kind of data called LiDAR data. It's where they have planes fly over, and they basically have a laser beam bounce up from the ground or the tree back to the plane. And LiDAR data has become a little bit less expensive, but recently all of Portage County was flown, and so we're going to have much more accurate data. But for the campus area, we had special LiDAR data flown so that we can do three-dimensional modeling. And so probably we're going to use this kind of data to basically create a terrain mapping of the campus area.
That would be really cool.
So yeah, we have the data now. We just have to basically corral all the students and start working on it. So those are the ones that come to mind immediately. But every year, you're right, always something comes up that we're working on the mapping project. Place, especially for a cartographer, the first thing we're always going to say is that place, there's going to define location. And naturally, somebody will say, oh, so there's some location on the Earth. Yes. And there's lots of different ways you can define that. But that's a very utilitarian mathematical way of doing it. Oh, we have latitude and longitude, and we have these other kinds of coordinate systems, such as WTM and UTM, and it goes on and on. And that's just basically saying, well, here is a location we find on Earth. But a lot of times we do that for navigation purposes. We're going from place to place. We want to be able to know what direction we're going in, how far it is, and so forth. But in true sense, for a cartographer, place, there's a certain essence that's always involved with that you identify a place, you can do it very simply, you can give it a label or a name, but it's like even previously we made the Menominee map, place name map of Wisconsin, that they basically didn't, they didn't have a specific place per se as kind of a region, and Menominee tribal group, they basically had always stories attached to it. That's why a place, to me, always has all this tapestry of information connected to it. And it could be very precise and unique, saying, this is my house, this is where I live. Or it could be something where I'm telling you a story about history, culture, features. It's like the same area. Here we have Stevens Point, but that's our name that we give to it. If we go back 2,000 years, again, we're looking at Menominee again. We're saying, okay, what kind of naming did you give this area? And so we have to recognize that there is a tapestry of background and history and culture always tied to a specific location. And so as a cartographer, yes, I want to know some detail of how to find that location. But there's always this idea of looking at locations and visualizing patterns of data, and a data kind of history that you always have to place. And how you interpret that can be very different, like we were talking with the Hmong versus a normal Western civilization. And so for cartographers, that's always fascinating in terms of investigating that. There's friends of mine in other universities, like at Oklahoma, University of Oklahoma, where he spent his whole life looking at, basically taking a look at Aborigines, for example, and saying, oh, I'm looking in terms of how they interpreted Australia, or how I'm looking at other types of Native American tribes in terms of how they basically looked at the present United States. So place to me, yes, there's always going to be location and identifying that, but there's always going to be this tapestry of information identified to that particular region. For example, on the last thing for the Menominee place names, one thing that we did is that we had the map created, and it's actually sitting over in the library. And there's only so many copies of that map made because the Menominee didn't want to have too many copies created, so it was very unique. But we also created an online map so that when you're looking at all the names that are on this map, we had Mike Hoffman from the Menominee tribe basically pronounce all this. So you can click on it, and he will pronounce the name itself. And then we haven't done this yet, and I don't know if it will be accomplished, but what I also wanted is that they have all these different stories that I wanted to basically record, so that when you clicked on the location, you heard the name, and then you'd hear the story behind all of that.
That would be really cool.
In fact, one of the things I was fascinated by that map was that when the students who were mapping this out with Mike Hoffman and other elders from the tribe, they basically had it so up in the Lake Huron area, they had, in a sense, stories of whales being there. And you'd say, whales, there's no whales there. But thousands of years ago, after the last ice age 10,000 years ago, and you had basically all this flooding occurring, whales likely were in that region. But their stories were passed down for so long that that's what marked that area. It had large stories about whales being in that location in Lake Huron. So again, people look at it and they say, oh, this is kind of interesting. But if you understand in terms of the fact that they passed down all the information and they connected it to their stories, from their grandkids down until the present time, I just thought that was so intriguing based upon that. And again, that's why maps have always been fascinating to me. Yeah, it's kind of funny. When I started as an undergraduate, I was originally in actually earth science and math, and I fell into geography because I wanted a discipline tied everything together so much. And I really liked that. I liked the idea that I could take all these discipline areas. My sisters, for example, are both mathematicians, so there's a family trait in that. But I liked it how you could take all this information and meld it together and understand the physical and the cultural and the human side to in place, that I just felt, well, that's what I wanted to pursue. So I ended up being a cartographer because of that. But what's ironic about that is that I discovered that in my lineage for my grandmother's side, my dad's side, there was always surveyors in the family. So it's kind of like, maybe I was meant to be this anyway. But I didn't even think about that when I was undergraduate. It's just I was attracted to that because it gave more substance and understanding about processes of both the human and the physical condition. So I ended up again in that area, and it's interesting to me. It's always fascinating because for a cartographer, when I was doing my graduate level work, I had to have really almost a minor in computer science. I had to have a minor in psychology in order to use some of this, because in terms of communication and cognitive and perceptual psychology, it was a big part of it. And a lot of times, until you're a junior or senior, at least undergraduate, sometimes you don't see the interconnectivity of a lot of these topics, but there's huge amounts that basically start to give you greater insight, your kind of eureka epiphanies that you have sometimes.